Well, hello there. I didn't see you come in. Make yourself at home. Have a drink. While I give some attention to some underappreciated characters and storylines that I personally love. And I hope you grow to love as well.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Today we're reading Swamp Thing number 115. And just a little recap on what's been going on. Swamp Thing and Abby's daughter, Tefé, has been stolen by an evil pirate named Dark Conrad. We're not sure exactly why. We know it has to do with something called the Old Ones that Dark Conrad serves. I'm assuming there's some kind of gods or whatnot. And not only did he capture Tefé, he also captured Abby. He also captured a bunch of townsfolk from Terrebonne Parish, people we've seen like LeBeau and his family. So they were all being held hostage by all these different pirates. And these are definitely cursed pirates, by the way, because Dark Conrad and his crew definitely look like their bodies have been merged with sea creatures. They very much resemble the pirate cast from Pirates of the Caribbean 2, Curse of the Dead Man's Chest. Not saying that they stole anything, but Swamp Thing did do it first. So in the last issue, we were left with Swamp Thing and John Constantine following Dark Conrad through the swamp and trying to rescue Abby and Tefé. So first things first, with issue 115, we got the cover here. The background looks like there's some kind of magical thing going on. We got a lot of swirls of purples and greens, and Swamp Thing's face is coming out of the purple and greens, and he is throwing out his hand, and out of his hand is flying a bright red bird, almost as if he's like freeing it or something. And it also looks like there's some kind of green sacks hanging from branches and stuff around Swamp Thing. So this cover is definitely more of just like a cool looking cover rather than describing whatever the story is in the book. And we also see on the cover that this is written by Nancy A. Collins with art by Tom Mandrake and inks by Kim DeMolder. And we start off on page 1 with some narration from Abby. We see that they're in the same place that they were before, which were some ancient ruins that Dark Conrad brought them to. And it seems we are exactly at the moment where Abby has been thrown down and Dark Conrad was kind of threatening her with Tefé in his hands. So Abby must have got a bump on her head because it seems like she's just coming to, and we get some narration saying, it's just a bad dream. A bad, crazy dream, but a dream nonetheless. She really isn't being held captive by a pack of mutant demon pirates from a distant hell dimension. Nor is an evil warlock called Dark Conrad threatening to sacrifice her child, not to mention several dozen of her friends and neighbors. Any moment now, she'll wake up in her husband's mossy embrace, and Alec will tell her it was all a bad dream, and then they'll make love. It was only a nightmare, nothing to worry about. And then we see Abby's eye open as she comes to full consciousness, and she looks up and she sees the necromancer Dark Conrad holding Tefé out with one hand and threatening her with his Freddy Krueger-like hand. And this is pretty much the exact same panel almost as the last panel from the last issue, except the vortex color behind them is red instead of yellow. So that's like the main difference. And they're in different positions. It's not like they reuse the same artwork. So we see Tefé is yelling out, "Mommy!" as Dark Conrad threatens her and laughs at her fear. And we see the name of this issue is Rum, Necromancy, and the Lash. Then we cut to Swamp Thing and John, and Swamp Thing has made himself into a boat where he is like the masthead of it, and it is the size of a dinghy, so it's kind of funny that there's even a masthead, and John is riding inside of him, and it seems like John is just talking about, I don't know, his life or something, and Swamp Thing says, "We must hurry if we are to foil Dark Conrad and his plan to open the way for his masters." And John says, "Well, pardon me. I'm bloody sorry I can't pop out of me bod and go farting through the green. Not everyone's an elemental, you know." And Swamp Thing, being the masthead of the boat, he can't like turn to John, so he's just staring straight forward, and John can't see his face, but Swamp Thing looks pretty angry, and he says, "If Yaya had not told me you were summoned here by the spirit of the swamp, I would have left you to your own devices. It is bad enough Abby and Tefé are threatened by this fiend, but to learn he is one of your ancestors does nothing to endear you to me." And John says, "Oh, sod off, you sanctimonious cabbage. I didn't ask you to use me as a bloody sperm bank," which means, of course, that your precious little Mary Sunshine is kin to the blighter as well. What do you think of that? And of course, John is referring to the Rick Veitch run, where Swamp Thing used John Constantine's body to get Abby pregnant with Tefé. And I believe those are the issues in the mid to late 70s of that Rick Veitch run. So anyway, back to the story. We cut to Dark Conrad holding Tefé up on like a hill, and it looks like he's about to sacrifice her. And Abby's freaking out, of course, and LeBeau is having to hold her back, and she's yelling, "Sweet Jesus, Tefé, give me back my baby!" And Dark Conrad says, "I'll return your darling hybrid, my dear. Would you like her served to you fricasseed, sauteed, or baked in a tasty pie?" And then all of a sudden, Tefé goes like Super Saiyan, and her eyes begin to glow green, and she says, "Bad, bad, Tefé make hurt." And then a green energy begins to glow from her body and shoot out, but it doesn't do anything. Dark Conrad says, "You're strong, changeling, I'll give you that. But you're too young, too inexperienced for your magics to do any good against the likes of me. And you'll not be growing any older, my pet." Then we cut back to the Swamp Thing boat and John. And Swamp Thing is filling John in on what the ghostly old man told Swamp Thing about the doubloon. And Swamp Thing says, "We must reclaim the gold doubloon given to me by Yaya. It's part of the lost treasure of the pirate John Lafitte, Dark Conrad's mortal enemy. I do not know what its power holds or what good it can do, but Yaya was adamant that we use it." And then we cut back to Abby, who is looking very angry, and we see the doubloon is right around her neck. And LeBeau, who was kind of holding her back, says, "Abby, who is this madman? Why is he doing this terrible thing?" And then Abby fills him in on what's been going on, kind of like Swamp Thing was just doing. But it's more for us as well, because I don't think in the last issue the writer ever said exactly what is going on with Dark Conrad and why he wants Tefé. So she says, "He calls himself Dark Conrad. He's some sort of wizard priest. He wants to open a doorway between our world and that of some other dimension. Hell, maybe." And then LeBeau says, "Dark Conrad, Sacre Dieu, I have heard the stories of this one, but I thought he was dead." And then Abby says, "If he's dead now, I wonder what the bastard was like when he was alive. Alec, where are you?" And right as she thinks that, we cut to the Swamp Thing boat pulling up to the bank of the ancient ruins. And Swamp Thing says, "How could I have not sensed such a thing in the heart of my own home?" And I'm glad he said it, because I think we were all wondering that. How was it possible that this giant ancient ruins growing in the middle of his swamp, especially because it's like evil? And they don't answer that question. They just leave it hanging. But John does say, "You're always the last to know, huh?" Which of course annoys Swamp Thing. And I just love the looks that Swamp Thing is giving to John. The entire time John opens his mouth, he's just giving him like evil side glances, and you can just really tell that he hates John very much. So then we cut back to Dark Conrad, who is now holding Tefé upside down by one leg, and she is crying out now, but she can't really do anything. And Dark Conrad saying, "Cry all you like, hybrid. It'll do you no good. The time has come for my masters to reclaim that which was rightfully theirs. It is time to bathe the threshold, and you shall be the first to bleed." But he is quickly interrupted as Swamp Thing says, "Don't you dare harm my daughter." And as Dark Conrad turns, we see out of the trees in the bog, a bunch of different Swamp Thing bodies come out. Now, we've seen something similar to this where in the Doug Wheeler run, Swamp Thing took over a bunch of his old husks and used them to fight. But because they don't show it, and I'm just kind of assuming this, it looks more like he grew a bunch of different versions of the same body. And the reason why I think it's that is because as he's talking, the words are coming out of not just one, but different ones as they walk forward. So Dark Conrad sees them and says, "So, Elemental, you have come for your whelp." And the Swamp Things say, "Release my wife and the others, pirate. You may be in the service of great power, but the swamp is mine." And then we get a panel of Dark Conrad's eyes opening wide like he's angry, and he says, "You dare to threaten me? Me? A servitor of they who walked before? You pathetic blade of grass. Who are you that I should be mindful of you?" And as he says that, his shirt bursts open, and we see that on his chest, he has like a squid beak coming out right in the middle of his chest. And not only that, but a bunch of octopus or squid arms also coming out. So I don't know if those were always there or if he just transformed, but if they were there, his shirt was doing a lot to hide it. So the Swamp Things begin to attack all the other pirates because I believe Dark Conrad is on like the top of a little hill or something. And Dark Conrad is yelling, "The Green's dominance is at an end. There is nothing you can do to stop me, Paladin." And Abby is trying to run to Alec to help him, and LeBeau is holding her back saying, "Non, this is LeBon Gumbo's fight. There's nothing we humans can do, not even you." Then we cut to a Swamp Thing body fighting off two pirates, and it is losing. He's losing his limbs to their swords. And as he's getting chopped up, he looks over and he sees John Constantine and he says, "Constantine, the coin, get the coin." And Constantine, who was just kind of hiding in the trees, says, "Christ, I knew I should have stayed in bed." But he listens to Swamp Thing and then he runs over to Abby and he kind of lunges at her. And because the coin is situated between her cleavage, John says, "Pardon me, ma'am. Mind if I admire your jewelry?" And he grabs the doubloon, but it also looks like he's definitely getting a feel while he's there. And Abby says, "What do you think you're doing?" And John replies, "Sorry, love, no time to explain." So now that he has the doubloon, he just runs away from her and throws it towards Swamp Thing and he says, "All right, Bog God, the ball's in your court." And we get a bunch of panels of the doubloon flying over the pirates' heads, and they all look up at it, and even Dark Conrad sees it, and he says, "What? No, it can't be. No!" And then we see a swamp hand catch it, and he says, "Yes, in the name of the swamp, I summon you." And then all of a sudden, the swamp gets all misty, and we see a bunch of zombie pirates coming out of the water, led by one particular one, and Swamp Thing looks at him and says, "Jean Lafitte." And those pirates begin to attack, but Jean Lafitte goes straight for Dark Conrad, and as he does, Dark Conrad says, "No, you're dead, dead and gone." But the mummified Lafitte says, "My Marie, Conrad, I swore I would never rest until I made you pay for what you did to my Marie. I have waited a long time, but now my vengeance is at hand. Prepare to rejoin your masters in hell." And with that, Jean Lafitte reaches the summit and lunges at Dark Conrad, and Dark Conrad, in preparation, has moved Tefé from his hands over to one of his tentacles. And for some reason, even though Jean Lafitte was raised with one of his cutlasses, he does not have that anymore, and Dark Conrad also doesn't have a cutlass on him, but he does have his Freddy Krueger hand, so he's not completely unarmed. So no, John is with Abby, and Abby's seeing this fight go down, and she says, "Oh my God, Tefé!" And Tefé, who's being kind of whipped around by these tentacles, is saying, "Mama, Daddy!" And Swamp Thing hears it and says, "Tefé!" But he's surrounded by a bunch of guys and he can't get away. And Abby and Constantine are watching, and even Constantine looks scared for her. And then the fight between Lafitte and Dark Conrad becomes so intense that he just throws Tefé, and she flies in the air yelling, "Daddy!" And we get some great panels of Abby and Swamp Thing's faces looking very horrified. But John Constantine saves the day. He rushes over and he's able to catch her, and he says, "Ooh, gotcha," as he falls to the ground. And then Tefé laughs at him and points at him and says, "Daddy?" Which is kind of true because he is the biological father, technically. But before John can really answer her, all of a sudden tentacles begin to wrap around him because one of the pirates that looks like an octopus begins to attack, and John says, "Great, out of the frying pan and into the bloody fire." But all of a sudden, the octopus kind of stops and has like a weird look on his face and goes, "Argh!" And then a Swamp Thing hand bursts from its chest and tears it apart. And we see Swamp Thing appear and he says, "We'll take her now if you don't mind." And John says, "You're bloody welcome, I'm sure." And Tefé sees Swamp Thing and she says, "Daddy!" But her joy is cut off as John says, "I hate to ruin this Kodak moment, folks, but I don't think we're free and clear yet." And he points to the battle going over with Dark Conrad and Lafitte. And it seems like things are getting pretty intense because now there's that vortex swirling all around them. And Swamp Thing looks at Abby and all the others and says, "Abby, Constantine, LeBeau, take the others and go now." And Abby protests saying, "Alec, I'm not leaving without you." But Swamp Thing's already walking away, and Constantine grabs her by the wrist and says, "Don't argue with your hubby in public. It's unbecoming. Come on, people, show's over. Time to go home." Then we cut to the fight with Dark Conrad and Lafitte, and Dark Conrad is saying, "You're persistent, Lafitte. I'll give you that. But that's all you are. Did you really think you stood a chance of defeating a servant of the old ones?" And as he says this, he raises his hand, and I guess he did some kind of spell because his body is completely engulfed by some kind of energy. It almost looks like he's on fire, but there's crackling around it. So I think it's just energy because on the next page, as we turn, we see that his skeleton is still there, but it's falling away from Dark Conrad lifeless. And Dark Conrad thinks he's won now, and he says, "Ha ha 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 ha! What did that idiotic lump of moss think he was doing, summoning Lafitte from his well-deserved grave?" And then Swamp Thing cuts in saying, "I was stalling for time. Time to do this. You asked me, Who am I that you should be mindful of me? And then we get like a half splash page where these ancient ruins are being dwarfed by a gigantic swamp thing. And it seems like either he's grown into a giant mountain or there was already some kind of hill or mountain behind these ancient ruins, and Swamp Thing is now the face of this mountain, and his hands are coming up out of the ground surrounding the ancient ruins. And Swamp Thing takes those hands, and I guess we're supposed to assume that everybody that ran away is good and safe and far away now, because he takes those hands and he smashes the hell out of those ancient ruins, and he yells, "I am Swamp Thing!" And then we cut to Abby and John, who are far away, and we can see smoke coming from behind the canopy of the swamp, so they can't see exactly what happened to the ancient ruins. So as they're staring at that, Swamp Thing walks out from the trees, and he begins to walk towards them. He has something in his hands, and Abby yells out, "Alec, thank God you're safe." And of course, Tefé sees him as well and says, "Daddy!" And Swamp Thing comes over to them and gives them a big hug, and Abby asks, "Is he dead?" And Swamp Thing says, "I don't know if one like Dark Conrad is capable of dying, but I have rid the swamp of him." And then she looks down and sees Swamp Thing holding something, and she says, "What's that you've got?" And Swamp Thing says, "Nothing, just a souvenir for Constantine. I thought you might appreciate a little something for the family album." And then he hands John the pirate flag from Dark Conrad's ship, and John says, "Real funny, by God. Thanks a lot." And that is the end of this story, but not the end of the issue, because as it would happen, we somehow managed to time this out perfect, where this is actually the Christmas issue of Swamp Thing. So we get a little epilogue that is actually a nice Christmas story. So we cut to LeBeau and his family, and they are about to go on a little boat ride in the bayou. And they don't really say, but I'm assuming this is after the events of what we just read. So as LeBeau is getting his family in the boat, he says to his son, who was the last one to leave the house, "It wouldn't do for us to miss the Christmas Eve bonfires. What with the youngins in the house, huh, Cher?" And he hands his son to his wife, and as he does, his son asks, "Papa, why do they light bonfires on Christmas Eve?" And then his other child cuts in and says, "What a stupid question, everyone knows that." And as LeBeau gets in the boat, he says, "Hush, Eugene, it's a perfectly good question. As to why we Cajuns light the bonfires, well, that's a long story, but a good one. It has to do with the swamp. The Acadians who first settled here long, long ago, and a man some call Santa Claus, but the Cajuns know as Papa Noel." And as he says this, they arrive at their destination, so I'm assuming either they live really, really, really close by, or we're just supposed to assume maybe they had a conversation before this, and we just jump some time. And what they're looking at is from the water's edge, there's docks, and from the docks, there's like a hill that goes up, and on top of the hill, there's a bunch of bonfires that are being lit. They're pretty big, because we're seeing people stand in front of them, and there's like 20 people in a row, and the bonfire is the whole length of them. Like I said, there's a bunch of bonfires, so there's a lot of people here. And LeBeau continues, "You see, Raoul, we Acadians did not always live in the swamps. Long ago, in the time of your grandma's grandma's grandma, we lived in a place called Nova Scotia. You see, this Nova Scotia, it was in a land called Canada. First it belonged to the French, then the British took it over. The British, they wanted the French-speaking Acadians to start talking English and swear allegiance to their king. But of course, the Acadians would not do these things, and they left Nova Scotia." And Raoul looks up at his dad and says, "Where'd they go, Papa?" And LeBeau answers, "They traveled along the Mississippi River, braving disease and wild Indians and all kinds of things. Then they come to Louisiana. It was here the Acadians finally made their home and became known as Cajuns." And this was kind of interesting to learn, because I never knew where the Cajuns came from as the people, and also the word Cajuns, I didn't know where that came from, but obviously it is just a different form of the word Acadians. So anyway, Raoul says, "But what does that have to do with Papa Noel and the bonfires, Papa?" And LeBeau says, "Don't worry, son, I'm getting to that. The Acadians have moved so far away from their old home, they were afraid Papa Noel, the spirit of Christmas, would not be able to find them. So they built bonfires on Christmas Eve to show them the way. And every Christmas Eve, Papa Noel leaves his secret workshop at the top of the world on his magic flying piroquet and brings toys, clothes, and food for all the good little boys and girls living in the swamps." And Raoul looks at him with wide-eyed wonder and says, "All the boys and girls?" And LeBeau says, "We." And then we get a bunch of panels where we get an overhead view of the bonfires, and then we begin to pull out to where we could just see the swamp, And then as the swamp is gigantic, then we begin to pull back in to a different location where we see a small house in the middle of the swamp. And this, of course, is Alec and Abby's house. And we see little baby Tefé in her crib, and there's a little stocking hung above her head. And Abby and Swamp Thing are in the room, and they're looking at her very lovingly. And that stocking was empty, so they walk out and they go get a bunch of toys. There's like a stuffed animal and an elephant toy and a ball and a couple candy canes. And while Tefé is sleeping soundly, they stuff the stocking completely full so that when Tefé wakes, she'll be completely surprised in the morning. But then all of a sudden, they hear a noise and they look up, and Abby says, "Alec, there's something on the roof." And as they run outside, Abby says, "Alec, you don't think that could have been?" And Swamp Thing says, "I'm not sure. I don't see anything." And as they look up at the sky, we can't see what they're seeing, but we do hear ho, ho, ho. And as we turn the page, we get a full page splash of Santa Claus riding in his flat bottom boat sleigh with, instead of reindeer, he's got alligators pulling his boat sled. And he is saying ho, 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 but it is spelled H-E-A-U-X. So I'm not sure if that's just a phonetic French spelling or if that's actually how you would say ho, ho, ho in French. But he is saying ho, 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 joyeux Noël et la bonne année. And please excuse my horrible pronunciation of those words, but I believe it says ho, 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 joy Noël for the good year. I'm assuming is what that last part meant, but I'm not sure. And I apologize if I'm horribly wrong with that. And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. So happy holidays to everybody. And I hope you guys have a nice Christmas. And if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planetransandcomicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And as always, remember to stay swampy.